Okay, great. Uh, so my apologies first of all for a bit of a delay. There were some technical errors, technical difficulties on my end. I was not able to join the meeting. Anyhow, uh, today we are supposed to begin with the topic of Article 12 and Article 13 and actually complete them. So before we begin, uh, since it's a new part of the constitution that we are beginning to discuss here, which is part three, fundamental rights. I would just like to brush upon a bit of your basics on uh, what fundamental rights are, right? Uh, so to begin with, when we talk about this part three of the constitution, which is fundamental rights, and as far as its importance related to the examination is concerned. See, this particular part is very important. And why do I say so? Because it's a very dynamic part of the syllabus, right? So, for instance, when the right to privacy judgment had just come, then questions based on that judgment were asked, right? Because it was, of course, a very landmark judgment of the Supreme Court. And even other landmark judgments of the Supreme Court are somehow related to this uh, part of fundamental rights, right? And therefore, it becomes very important for us to stay updated with the knowledge of this part, the basic, first of all, how the law has evolved since the time the Constitution has come into force, and then secondly, what are the latest developments or what is the current trend of interpretation in the law. All right. So before we go into the exact details of what fundamental rights are and what is there in Article 12 and Article 13, it is important for us to understand what rights and duties are in general. Right. So, if I may know, are there people from a non-law background here? First of all, can anyone unmute and speak in the session, or have they been muted? I'll just stop sharing for a while. Harshvardhan, Yatri. Yeah, I can't hear you,
Sir, I'm
Harshvardhan.
audible?
Or can you just type in the chat box whether all the participants are coming from a law background or they're coming from a non-law background?
Yes, sir. Am I audible now?
Yes, Harshvardhan, you're audible.
Good evening, sir. So I'm from law background, faculty of law, Delhi University. So my
Oh,
background is law, and I would be looking forward to preparing for civil services, perhaps next year or in the near future. But I just came here to take a
all
get a feel of the class and the idea of the subject. Although I'm familiar with it, but just for the sake of the understanding.
right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. I'll just quickly again go back to sharing my screen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, all right. So, okay, so you may be knowing something about, or in fact, a lot about what rights and duties are. But just to, just to basically wrap up in a few pointers of what rights and duties are actually. Uh, See, basically, a right would mean an entitlement, and a duty would mean an obligation. Okay, so I'm entitled to a certain thing or to be, to be treated in a certain way. Whereas if someone has a certain duty, then they have an obligation to do something, right? Or not to do something. All right. Now, I would take you a bit into jurisprudence. Of course, people who are coming from a law background would know more about it. But when in jurisprudence we discuss this Hoffeldian's jural correlative, right? Then in that we understand that if someone has a right, it exists with respect to someone else who has a duty, right? So in case of fundamental rights, it's mostly the citizens or the people who have the right, and the duty or the obligation lies with the state. Generally speaking, although in exceptional circumstances, even in fundamental rights, the duty would lie with other citizens or other persons. But in a general sense, when we talk about fundamental rights, we have the rights, whereas the duty lies with the state. All right. Then also coming to the point where we discuss what are the different types of rights. Generally, we understand that there are certain constitutional rights which are guaranteed in other parts of the constitution. All right. Then there are certain legal rights or certain statutory rights which are guaranteed by certain specific acts. For example, the right to information. So RTI is guaranteed under a specific act, right? So that becomes a legal right or a statutory right. And then, of course, there are fundamental rights which go to the very core, or which are in a way which cannot be very easily compromised, right? So these are the fundamental rights that people in our country have guaranteed through the Constitution of India. All right. So nothing very complex till now, I suppose. So let's just move ahead with the discussion. Now, if you have to write in your exam what fundamental rights are, I would encourage you to pick up this line from the Golaknath judgment, which is Golaknath versus State of Punjab. It is a 1967 judgment delivered by the Supreme Court. Now, in this judgment, it was said that fundamental rights are the primordial rights necessary for the development of human personality. So, this is very important, that these are, in a way, so primary to our existence or our development, right? That they have been titled as fundamental rights. Then further, it says that they are the rights which enable a man to chalk out his own life in the manner he likes best. Right? So all these rights combined provide us that sense of liberty, provide us that sense of freedom, right? Through which we can we in a way feel entitled to do whatever we wish to do, right? For example, if any person wishes to prepare for the civil services examination, then uh, pursuant to they meeting their certain basic requirements, pursuant to they being a graduate of any college or university recognized uh, under the civil services examination rules, they are eligible to sit for the examination, right? And in a similar way, different people are entitled to do different things, right? So this is one part of the judgment which I feel is, will quite add an impression if you quote this in the examination whenever there's a question arising on fundamental rights coming before you. Right. So moving ahead, we would also note certain features of fundamental rights. All right. Now, what are these features? First is that fundamental rights can be available to either the citizens, or they can be available to all persons, including citizens and non-citizens. Right? So that we will see once we discuss each and every right, right, which are available to all the people, which are available to only the citizens and not available to the non-citizens. But generally, we can say that it is a feature of this part three of the Constitution that it is in certain cases available to citizens, in certain cases it is not available to the it is available to all the people. Sorry, right? Then secondly, uh, fundamental rights are qualified rights. Now, why do we say that they are qualified rights? Because in certain cases there are reasonable restrictions applicable. Right? For example, if I'm sure you all of you would have heard about sedition. It's always there in the news. Someone or the other is caught up in cases related to sedition. So sedition, what does that basically deal with? If I talk about certain fundamental rights, then under the law of sedition, basically there are certain reasonable restrictions imposed on the freedom of speech and expression that person. So my freedom of speech and expression would go to the extent that I should not be encouraging any hostile reactions against the government, or I should not be encouraging enmity against the government, or encouraging waging a war, right? So in that sense, we say that fundamental rights are qualified rights. Or even if I talk about the freedom of speech and expression in the sense I relate it to the law of defamation, then my right to free speech and expression goes to the extent that I should not be defaming any other person, right? So I should not be abusing any person unnecessarily in the public, right? So all those things are that have to be taken care of when we exercise our fundamental. Then thirdly, fundamental rights are justiciable rights. Justiciable, what do we mean by that? We mean that they have to be, they can be rather justified in a court of law, right? So if my fundamental right is being violated, I can approach a constitutional court. I can approach either my high court. I can approach the Supreme Court, right? And I can seek remedy for the violation of my fundamental. Then the fourth point is fundamental rights can be amended, right? And how can that be amended? We'll just see. In the future lectures, we'll be seeing what is the amending procedure of the Constitution. And then finally, fundamental rights can be suspended. Now, this also in detail we will see when we study emergency, but many of the fundamental rights can be suspended during a state of emergency. That is something that we have to understand at the outset, basically, right? Now, beginning with Article 12, right? Article 12 essentially is titled as definition, but it essentially talks about what will be covered under the definition of the term state when we discuss fundamental rights. Right? So as I initially told you that in most of the circumstances, fundamental rights are enforced against the state. So at the outset, it is important for us to understand this term, what is meant by this term, the state. Okay. Now it's a very plain and simple definition per se. We will just read it together. Now this definition says that in this part, so this definition of the state is only applicable to part 3. Okay. This is what we have to keep in mind. So it says that in this part, unless the context otherwise requires, the state includes the government and parliament of India and the government and the legislature of each of the states and all local or other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of the government of India. Okay. So in detail, we can say that when we break this definition, we see that there are 4 elements of Article 12. Okay. Now, what are these 4 elements? First is the government and Parliament of India. Okay. Second, legislature of each of the states. Okay. Now, for the time being, forget about the other 2 elements. Let's just focus on these first 2 elements. Okay. Now, here there is nothing complex about them. It is fairly simple to understand that the government and Parliament of India and the government and the legislature of each of the states essentially means that the legislative and executive, legislature and executive at the level of the central government and at the level of the state government. So at the level of the union and the state governments, that is covered under the definition of the state under Article 12. Okay. So there's nothing complex as such to understand here. Simply legislature and the executive. Okay. So nothing special to interpret. Okay. Now let us come to the third and fourth element of this definition. The third element is all local or other authorities within the territory of India. Okay. Fourth element is all local or other authorities under the control of the government of India. All right. Now, what had to be interpreted is what is meant by this term other authorities, or what all would fall under this definition other authorities. Okay. Now, this was something which had to be interpreted by the courts. Now, this interpretation had been going on for quite some time. Now, there were certain cases in earlier term, in earlier years as well. However, for you, I would take you directly to the landmark cases. Okay. So we will not be unnecessarily discussing the older law. We will just discuss what the law, how the law stands at the time being. Okay. Now, the major or the most important or the most landmark case when it comes to interpreting the term authority is this case of R.D. Shetty versus the International Airport Authority of India. It is popularly also known as the R.D. Shetty case or the Airport Authority case. Okay? But it's better that you always write the full title of the case. And if I understand that remembering the complete citation of each and every case may not be feasible for everyone, but at least if you write the year of the judgment and the court which delivered the judgment, which would mostly be Supreme Court because we would be discussing landmark judgments given by the Supreme Court. In such cases, you should at least mention the year and the court so that it leaves an impression on the examiner, whosoever is checking your copy, is pleased to know that you remember the complete title of the judgment and that you also remember the year of the judgment. Okay. So now coming to our point, what was the law laid down in R.D. Shetty versus the International Airport Authority of India case when it comes to interpreting the term authority? So in this judgment, the Supreme Court said that we are laying down certain tests, which are essentially they can be grouped into four tests. So it said that we are essentially laying down four tests to determine whether an authority is an agency or instrumentality of the government. The first one being, what is the magnitude of government's financial support to the authority? So if majority of the revenue is coming from the government, then in that case, the authority would come under the definition of the state under Article 12. Okay, so this is first, financial resources, financial support or financial resources. Second is deep and pervasive control over the management of the authority. Now, if government has this deep and pervasive control over the management, what would that mean typically is that let us take the example of LIC of India. Okay, now government is the majority stakeholder. Okay, government appoints a majority of the members on the board of directors, directly or indirectly. Okay, so in this sense, we can say that whatever decision is taken by the board of directors of LIC is essentially being taken on behalf of the government. Why? Because the government itself is electing those board members. Okay, right. So that is what is meant by deep and pervasive control over the management of the corporation. Right. Then next is, in fact, from this I remember there was a question asked in, I think, in West Bengal Judicial Services exam. This question was asked that there is a particular corporation which which is being run by the government, but then the government had in fact transferred some 60% of the shares to some person, and then that person had actually become had actually gathered the power to appoint the majority of the board members. So, what do you say? Will this corporation continue to be an authority under the definition of state under Article 12 or not? So, of course, clearly, since someone else has control and someone else has the majority financial stake in the corporation, then in that case, it would cease to be a an authority under the definition of state under Article 12, right? So these are some kind of questions that can be asked. Then third is, does it enjoy monopoly status and government's protection? Okay. For example, take the case of railways. Now, railways, so just now, like a few years back, or in fact a few months back only, there has been a certain degree of privatization in railways. But if we consider the situation of a few years down the line, a few years ago, then we can comfortably say that railways had the monopoly to run train services or run rail services in the country. Okay, so in that case, had that monopoly status. So of course, it would be an authority. So IRCTC would of course be an authority under the definition of state or under Article 12. We can say that. Then fourth and the final one is the authority carrying on public functions that are closely related to the government function. Now, what would be the government's core function? For example, let us take the example of maintaining law and order. Okay. Now, let us say that police is directly coming under the state government, but by special legislation, the state government is also forming a separate kind of a force which is responsible for maintaining law and order. Okay, but it is somehow not directly stating that it is an authority. Okay, so but if we realize that that particular authority is carrying a public function that is closely related to government function, which in our case, the example that we are taking would be the maintenance of law and order, then that authority can be considered as state under Article 12. Okay. However, after laying down these four tests, it was also said by the court that it will have to consider this is a landmark judgment of RD Shetty case, which talks about the test laid down to court will have to, as I just said, that the court will have to consider the cumulative effects, right? So it may be that certain factors are being met, it may be that certain factors are not being met. For example, in all the cases, it's not necessary that some kind of monopoly is being exercised. Okay. For example, take the case of ONGC. Now, ONGC is not the only oil and petroleum company in India. There are other companies also. There are private ventures. There is Reliance, which is also dealing with petroleum products, right? And similarly, there are other corporations. However, that does not stop us from saying that because it is not a monopoly, it will not be considered as an authority under Article 12. It is an authority because in the case, the government is responsible for its management. The government is responsible for providing capital to it. All right. So in this sense, we can say that it's not necessary that all the four tests have to be met necessarily. It can be that certain tests are being met, or it can be that just one test is being met. But based on that only, we can say that that authority is actually state under Article 12. Okay, but these are broadly the parameters over which we will be judging this question or over which we will be answering this question. All right. Now, okay. Now, moving forward, there is another landmark judgment in this respect based on Article 12, which is called Ajay Hasia versus Khalid Mujib. Okay. Now, this is popularly known as Ajay Hasia case, and it is from the year 1981. Now, interestingly, Justice P.N. Bhagwati was there in R.D. Shetty case also, and he was also there in the bench that was listening to this Ajay Hasia case. So, adding to the tests that had been laid out in the R.D. Shetty case, Justice Bhagwati only went on to lay down one additional test to determine whether whether an authority could be considered a state under Article 12 or not. And what was this test? It was whether a department of the government has been transferred to a corporation. Okay? So often it used to happen that, let us say, there is a certain function of the government which is being run through a government department. But because there has been in the past few years there has been a tendency to run businesses through a corporate mode, so those departments would get converted into a corporation. But in this case it was laid down that under the garb of converting a department to a corporation, the state cannot uh, exempt itself of its liability. Okay, so if essentially the corporation is also performing a public function, if essentially the corporation is being funded by the government, if essentially the corporation is being governed by the government, right, then it would still continue to be authority under Article 12. And what was the conclusion in this Ajay Hasia case? It was said that a society registered under the Societies Registration Act can be an agency or instrumentality of the state. Okay. So again, here there is nothing complex as such. Just remember the four tests laid down in R.D. Shetty plus the fifth test laid down in Ajay Hasia. Okay. So if you otherwise understand from a textbook of constitutional law of India, there are certain other cases also which talk about whether a body is state or not. However, for the purposes of examination, we would only focus on the landmark judgments, and these two are the landmark judgments which I have already told you. Okay, so let's not go into here and there. Okay, so let's just focus on R.D. Shetty and Ajay Hatia. Okay, so I hope you will remember these. And yeah, okay. So we'll come to the last point, which we are to discuss under Article 12, which is judiciary to be considered state under Article 12 or not? Now, there are two angles to it, or there are two perspectives to it. One is that when we talk about judiciary, then when we discuss high courts, when we discuss Supreme Courts, they have to perform certain administrative, non-judicial functions. And of course, their core function, which they have to perform, is their judicial function or adjudicating the disputes. Now, in the judgment of A.R. Antule versus R.S. Nair, again, this is a very landmark judgment. We will keep on reading this throughout our discussion in Constitution Law. For the time being, for the topic that we are discussing, it is important to remember that in A.R. Antule versus R.S. Nair, it was said that administrative functions of the court can be considered under Article 12, which means what? What would be the administrative functions of the court? For example, there is recruitment. Okay, so in the case of recruitment, let's say the generally in a lot of states, the High Court is responsible for recruiting the lower judiciary for conducting the lower judiciary exam, right? For example, the Delhi High Court is the responsible body for conducting Delhi Judicial Services examination. So when this exercise of recruitment is being conducted, or when there are, there are aspects related to appointment, promotions, transfers, right? Then all these would be the administrative functions of the court. Okay, so when the court is performing or when the judiciary is performing these administrative functions, it will be considered Article 12, which essentially means what? If through its administrative function, the court is violating a person's fundamental rights, then they can approach either the Supreme Court under Article 32 or they can approach the High Court under Article 226. Okay. Uh, Essentially, when we are discussing this part, Article 12 to 35, Part 3, Fundamental Rights, then we can say that on the administrative side of things, or while performing the administrative functions, the even the judiciary becomes amenable to writ jurisdiction. All right. However, the other side, when the court is undertaking its judicial function or when judicial proceedings are going on, then it cannot be treated as state under Article 12. Okay, and this was laid down when? This was laid down in which case? It was laid down in Rupa Ashok Hurra versus Ashok Hurra. Okay, this again is a landmark judgment from 2002. Now, if we think about it, why was it that this judicial function has been excluded from the ambit of Article 12? Now, this is because if you think about it, then what the court is essentially doing is deciding what is right and what is wrong. Okay. Now, in every case, if let's say a person's if any adverse judgment comes against any party, right, then it will have a tendency to go to the court under writ jurisdiction and say that this judgment of the court is violating my fundamental rights. So please hear my matter under writ jurisdiction or under Article 32, or essentially saying that my fundamental right is getting violated. Okay. However, that cannot be done. It's practically not feasible. And why is it? Because it is essentially the function of the court to decide which party is right, which party is wrong, what relief to give to one, relief has to be given or not. Now, if uh, all the parties are allowed to say that court, while undertaking its judicial function, can be treated as a state under Article 12, then this additional remedy would open up for all the parties. which would result what we call in which would open the floodgates of litigation. It is a very commonly used phrase and a very popular one. But essentially, if we provide parties this remedy, then that floodgate would open, which we do not want. Of course, it does not make any sense. See, if a party is, not satisfied with a judgment that is delivered against them by any court or an order that has come against them, they of course have the option of going into appeal. They have the option of going into review. They also, in the Supreme Court, also have the option of filing a curative petition, right? So since all these remedies already exist, then we need not open up this remedy under Article 12 by adjudicating, by saying that the judiciary is also stated under Article 12, right? And that is why judicial proceedings have been excluded from it. Okay, so this is the last and final part of Article 12. Now, here we have seen basically essentially two things or a couple of things. We have seen the four elements of Article 12. Okay, we have seen how the term authority was interpreted in two landmark judgments. First one being R.D. Shetty case or the Airport Authority case. Second one being the Ajay Hasia case. Okay, and then finally we also answered the question whether judiciary is a state under Article 12 or not. Right. So this brings us to the conclusion of Article 12. Okay. Now I shall move ahead and discuss Article 13. Okay. So if there are any confusions related to Article 12, or if there are any questions, if you have any comments, you can put them in the chat box, right? I will maybe answer them now. I'll maybe answer them towards the end of the class. But from my end and from the perspective of your civil services examination, Article 12 has been sufficiently dealt with. You need to remember these points. And from my experience, from whatever study and analysis I have done, and we at Law Experts and we have done, there have been certain questions in the past which are directly asked on Article 12, and these questions have been worth uh, minimum 10 marks, I would say. Okay, so considering that, it is important for you to understand, and it's also, of course, fairly easy. There's nothing complex about Article 12. Okay, so yeah, so keeping that in mind, keeping your 10 marks in mind, please be very thorough with the concept of Article 12. Okay, then moving towards Article 13. Now, Article 12 talks about what is meant by the term the state. It defines the state. Now, in Article 13, we will see that it answers basically what would be considered law for the sake of enforcement of fundamental rights. So, Article 13 is titled Laws Inconsistent with or in Derogation of the Fundamental Rights. Okay. Now, 13.1 says all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of this constitution, insofar as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, shall, to the extent of such inconsistency, be void. Okay. Also, one more thing. I hope all of you are sitting with your bare acts. Okay. So whenever there is a class, either I am taking or other educators are taking the class, please make sure that you are sitting with your bare act in your hand, right? So that you are also able to look and mark any important portions, whatever you feel is important, whatever you feel you want to revisit again whenever you are studying next. Okay. So please, in all future sessions, ensure that you have your bare act. And if you don't have the bare act right now, please make sure you buy the latest bare act. Okay. Coming back, I will just repeat what Article 13.1 says. It says all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of this constitution, insofar as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, shall, to the extent of such inconsistency, be void. Okay, so we can again, wherever there is a comma, we can divide this Article 13(1) into different parts. Okay, and it is essentially talking about the laws which were in force in India, which was in force in the territory of India even before the constitution had commenced. Okay, so the constitution came into force when it came into force in 1950. Okay, even before that, there were certain laws passed by the British legislature, which there are, in fact, there are certain laws still in which are still in vogue, which were framed by the Britishers and which we have not amended. Okay, like the Indian Contract Act, the Indian Penal Code, and there are a zillion other laws which were there before the Constitution had commenced. All right. So Article 13(1) talks about these pre-constitutional laws. Okay, but we generally term it as pre-constitutional. Now, all laws in force in the territory of India immediately before the commencement of this constitution, in so far as they are inconsistent with the provisions of this part, shall, to the extent of such inconsistency, be void. So it is not saying that the whole law would become void. It is just saying that it would, to the extent that it is inconsistent, it will become void. Okay, we'll just deal with it in more detail in a coming few minutes. Let me just first take you through the complete Article 13. Now, Article 13, Clause 2 says that the state see, now the pre-constitutional laws is part is done with. Now it says how the state should make laws in future. Okay, so this is now from pre-constitutional we are coming to post-constitutional. So now for that, it says that the state shall not make any law which takes away or abridges the rights conferred by this part, and any law made in contravention of this clause shall, to the extent of the contravention, be void. Okay? So now it is saying that the state shall not, from now on, make any law which is taking away or which is abridging the right conferred by this part, which is basically talking about fundamental rights. And if such a law is made, then to the extent that it contravenes the rights guaranteed under this part, it should be void. Okay. So 13(1) pre-constitutional, 13(2) post-constitutional, 13(3). 13(3) says in this article, now 13(3) is doing what? 13(3) is telling us what essentially would be covered under the term law. 13(3) says that in this article, unless the context otherwise requires, law includes any ordinance, order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom, or usages having in the territory of India the force of law. Laws in force includes laws passed or made by legislature or other competent authority in the territory of India before the commencement of this constitution and not previously repealed, notwithstanding that any such law or any part thereof may not be then in operation either at all or in particular places. Okay, so it is basically enlisting what all would be covered by law. Ordinance is law, bylaws are law, rules are law, regulations are law, customs or usages are law, right? And it says that even if these laws were not in operation in the whole territory or they were not in operation in particular parts of the country, they would still be considered as law for the purpose of determining its its extent under Article 13, Clause 3. Okay. Then finally, Article 13, Clause 4 which was added by 24th Constitutional Amendment 1971. I repeat once again, Article 13(4), which was added by 24th Constitutional Amendment, says that nothing in this article shall apply to any amendment of this Constitution made under Article 368. Okay. Now, Article 368 is essentially talking about the amendment procedure. We will discuss it more elaborately when we discuss amendments to the Constitution in the coming lecture. Okay. Now, let me discuss each and every point in detail. Now, when we were talking about Article 13(1), it was basically putting the point forward that whatever laws were existing at the time of commencement of the Constitution and they being inconsistent with the provisions of Part 3 or they being inconsistent with the fundamental rights, they shall be void to the extent of the inconsistency. Okay. However, it will of course not have any retrospective operation, which means what? That the previous acts which were committed before the constitution had come into force. Okay. So, for example, let's say there was a particular law which was affecting a person's freedom of speech and expression. Okay, and there were certain proceedings that had commenced against a person, Mr. X, under that law. However, after that, the constitution comes into force. Okay, now because the constitution has come into force on a date after the commencement of the proceedings which are being still carried on under the act which was good at some point of time, but now it has become bad law because of the constitution coming into force, those proceedings would still continue as they were. Why? Because it is a very logical interpretation that whatever was good law on the date when the proceedings or when the prosecution was launched, okay, that will not be vitiated by the coming of constitution by the constitution coming into force. Okay, so the crux is that there will not be a retrospective operation and the previous acts will not get affected. Okay, now coming to a major doctrine which is based on this uh, part of extent of inconsistency or extent of contravention. It is the doctrine of severability. Now, it is very important for you to understand what this doctrine actually means. This doctrine of severability, now, when we say that the constitution has come into force, okay, now there is a certain legislation, or okay, all of you would have heard about the Shreya Singhal judgment. Okay, now Shreya Singhal judgment, it what it does is that there was a criminal provision under Article 66A of the IT Act. Okay, now it basically repealed that provision of Article 66A, saying that it is unconstitutional. All right, fair enough. But when we say that Section 66A of the IT Act is unconstitutional, do we throw the complete IT Act in the dustbin? Or should we just say that, listen, this particular section is problematic, it is unconstitutional, just remove this, throw it out, and let the remaining act be there? All right. This is what is essentially discussed under doctrine of severability. This doctrine says that what should be the parameters of judging whether whole act should be declared void or only that part which is inconsistent with the constitution, which is inconsistent with the fundamental rights, that should be deleted and the rest of that should be kept as it. Okay, so how should that be decided? Okay, so there are certain factors of severability which were laid down in this case of RMD Chamal Bagwala versus Union of India in the year 1957. Okay, now these factors, I will just very quickly go through them. Now, the first factor is that whether the valid parts of the statute or the act are separable from the invalid parts, or what was the intent of the legislature, that has to be kept in mind. Okay. So, for example, let's say there is a certain act which has specifically, uh, okay, let's take the hypothetical example of Citizenship Amendment Act. Okay. Now, uh, let's say that whatever were the amendments that were recently introduced, let's say in a hypothetical scenario that they are declared as unconstitutional. Fair enough. Now, if those parts can be kept separate from the remaining provisions of the act, okay, depending on the intention of the legislature, then the doctrine of severability would say that, okay, declare those inconsistent parts as unconstitutional and let the remaining act be there as it is. However, if the complete act is, based on certain grounds which are violating the constitution, again, this is a hypothetical scenario. Let's say if that has happened, then in that case, if the intention of the legislature is to do something unconstitutional, right, which it cannot essentially do, then in that case, the whole of the statute will be declared invalid. Okay, so this is the first factor. Secondly, it says that if the valid and invalid provisions are so mixed up that they cannot be separated from one another, then the whole act should go in its entirety. Thirdly, it says that if they are valid and distinct from those which are, there are valid parts which are distinct and separate from those which are invalid, right? But the intention is to put them together as a whole, as a composite scheme. Then also the whole of the act would be invalid. Fine. Thirdly, if they are independent, but if, let's say, it says that if what is left after omitting invalid is so thin as to, just not leave anything. Let's say, for example, there is a particular act which has only 7 sections. Okay. Now, out of those 7 sections, 5 are declared as unconstitutional. What is left? Let's say just section 1 is left. Section 1 says that this should be the title of the act. What will we do about it? Okay. There's no utility of having that. So once, if let's say the unconstitutional part is removed and what is left is essentially nothing, then there will be no utility of having that act. Okay. So in that case also the whole statute will be rejected in its entirety. It will be declared unconstitutional. Fifth point is that if the whole act has to be examined as a whole, right, then that also has to be seen whether that, what does that examination reveal, whether parts can be separated or not, or whether they are so intertwined that they cannot be, they cannot be separated, or they cannot exist without each other. So that is also one perspective to it. And then finally, if whatever is left, it is not suitable to be enforced as a law, then that would also go. And then finally, one, in these circumstances, we also have to look at the legislative history, the intention, the object, the preamble. What does it say? Right? All these things also have to be looked at. Okay. So when it comes to discussing doctrine of severability, this Case of RMD Chamalbagwala versus Union of India 1957. It is a landmark judgment and it lays down the seven tests of determining this severability of a statute. Alright, moving ahead, the second doctrine that we discuss under Article 13 is the doctrine of eclipse. Okay, now what does eclipse mean? Eclipse means to hide behind in the shadow. Okay, so this doctrine essentially says that an existing law which is inconsistent and violating the fundamental rights, it becomes inoperative from the date when the constitution came into force. Okay, what does it mean? It means that the law remains eclipsed and dormant under the fundamental rights shadow. However, it is not dead law. Okay, so it has only become inoperative. It has not become inexistent. Okay, so it will not be considered as a dead letter of law. It can be revived by an amendment or otherwise be made enforceable against others, for example, non-citizens. So, for example, there was a particular law in force against all persons. Then the constitution came into force, and certain fundamental right which was only guaranteed to the citizens of India, that was that particular act was violating that fundamental right guaranteed only to the citizens. Okay, so what would happen is that whatever part is inconsistent in this case, let's say if the inconsistency is with its applicability to the citizens, then that part would be covered uh, by the constitution, so that would in a way eclipse. But it's to the extent that particular law is applicable to non-citizens, the act would still continue to apply. Okay, so these this was essentially laid down in the case of Bikaji Narayan versus State of MP. So just to briefly uh, make you go through the facts of this case, there was a particular legislation which said that in a particular territory, only one person can have a kind of a monopoly over the transportation business, basically bus transport at that point of time. So, but when the constitution came into force, there was freedom to do business. Article 19(1)(g) guaranteed that. So, based on that, uh, there was a kind of an eclipse effect, and that you can say that act had become violative of fundamental rights. Okay, because now there cannot be a monopoly. Okay, but then after some point of time, in about an year or so, the first Constitutional Amendment Act came into brought into effect Article 19(6). Okay, saying that there can be reasonable restrictions on freedoms guaranteed under Article 19(1)(g). Now, because of that, that eclipse effect had again underwent a change. Okay, so basically, in this case, it was said that from the commencement of the constitution, from that date to the date of coming into force of the first constitutional amendment, there was an eclipse effect on this particular person's right. But then, because the fundamental rights or the part 3 was amended, this eclipse effect was in a way, and underwent fundamental changes, and its effects were reversed. Okay, so this is meant by doctrine of eclipse. Then finally, we come to doctrine of waiver. Now this is very easy to understand. What we understand by waiver is that any kind of right can be waived, or whether it can be waived at all or not. Okay, so now there's this one fundamental landmark case called Basheshwar Nath versus Income Tax Commission. It is from 1959. In this case, it was held that fundamental rights cannot be waived. And why was this held? This was held because if tomorrow the courts interpret and say that fundamental rights can be waived, then under circumstances of getting pressurized, people are so disempowered in this country that they will start giving up or they will start waiving their fundamental rights in exchange of certain other. Okay, so that is why to essentially strengthen that backbone of the fundamental rights regime, it was said that this doctrine of waiver will not apply to us and fundamental rights cannot be waived. Okay, then finally, are judicial decisions considered law under Article 13? The answer is no. Okay, because again, according to the same argument that was extended to Article 12, if we say that judicial decisions should be considered law under Article 13, then again it would be opening a floodgate of litigation because again and again people will come to the court saying that their rights or their fundamental rights are being violated because of a judicial decision, which we do not want, of course. Finally, coming to Article 13.4, as I just told you, that the 24th Constitutional Amendment 1971, it added Clause 4 to Article 13. There is certain excerpt from Article 368 that I have picked up. It says that nothing in Article 13 shall apply to any amendment made under this article, and no amendment of this Constitution shall be called in question in any court on any ground. Okay. Now we can also Article 368 Part 5 says that it is hereby declared that there shall be no limitation whatever on the constituent power of Parliament to amend by way of addition, variation, or repeal the provisions of this Constitution under this article. Okay. So in a way, this is giving unlimited power to the Parliament. Okay. Because the Parliament is saying that whatever we do, whatever is covered of in whatever way we amend the constitution, it shall not be questioned. Okay, but I mean, of course, it blatantly it cannot be there because in that case, the parliament can be motivated by an ill will and it can take any kind of a wrong decision also. To take care of that, we have these judgments of Keshavananda Bharati and Minerva Mills, wherein it was said that fine, you make an amendment, you can also amend part 3. The parliament can also amend part 3 of the constitution, which is fundamental rights. But it's just that any amendment should not be violative of the basic structure of the constitution. And as we understand, basic structure of the constitution is not a crystallized concept. Its interpretation can vary uh, one from one period of time to another, and based on this, essentially to say that the basic structure is protected would be protecting uh, the essential guaranteed fundamental rights. So even though the parliament has the power to amend part 3 of the constitution, it can not in any case violate the basic structure of the constitution. All right. So this is it for the time being. Again, just to quickly revise Article 13, we have discussed pre-constitutional laws, we have discussed post-constitutional laws, we have discussed three doctrines: doctrine of severability, then then the case of CMD Chamar Bagwala. Then we have discussed doctrine of eclipse. We have discussed one case in that. We have discussed doctrine of favor, and then we have finally come to discuss Article 13.4. How is it has come into being, and how it is related to the basic structure. Okay, so I hope this much was understood by all of you, right? And if there's anything else, you can let me know in the chat box. there's any doubt, if you can unmute, if you want to ask anything related to Article 12 and Article 13. I hope this much would have made it clear for you. Again, as I said, I have gone through the previous year papers. There have been some questions directly on Article 12, right? So please take care of that. Please go through these fairly simple articles to understand, nothing much complex about them. Okay, thank you. Then, on behalf of law experts, I thank you all for participating in today's class, and let's continue this. Just in case, still later, if you have any doubts, then I'm sure you can reach out to the management team, and they would let me know. I would definitely reply back as soon as possible. Okay, then I think we can then close the meeting in that case. Okay, there's a question uh, which I cannot see. Okay, so there's a question saying that is there any circumstance that fundamental right can be waived? So as I just told you, the Indian constitutional scheme does not permit a waiver of rights, a waiver of fundamental rights, right? And why is that? That is essentially because once that waiving gets permitted, then the common citizens of the country are so disempowered, or you can say the state can actually be so mighty if it tries to be, that it would essentially force those citizens to, waive their rights again and again, because they do not have the potential, or they do not have the resources to stand against the might of the state. Okay, so considering that in mind, this waiving of fundamental rights is not allowed under the Indian constitutional scheme. Okay, so that is why, as I just told you, waiver is not permitted. Waiver of fundamental rights is not permitted. In fact, this is the argument that was extended in the case of Bashishar Nath versus Income Tax Commissioner. If you would go through it, the state had made this argument that the other party has, in a way, waived their fundamental right, but the court said no. This is completely nonsense. This cannot be done, and that is the crux of the argument. So I hope that uh, query of yours is addressed. All right. Anything else? Or can we then close the discussion? Okay, then I think there are no more queries. In case, yeah, so in case there are any other queries, you can definitely write to us at any point of time, and I would be happy to answer them. Okay, then see you in the next session. Bye bye, take care, and do revise. Yeah, okay, all the best for your preparation. Bye bye.